Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see all of you again. My name is Will Inboden. I'm the director of the Hamilton Center. It's an honor to have you with us today. For those of you who don't know, the Hamilton Center is a relatively new academic unit here on campus. Our mission is teaching and research in the great books, Western civilization, American foundations, educating students in the virtues of a free society, promoting civil discourse on campus, and other small and untidy tasks like that. So anyway, among other things, we aim to enrich the intellectual discourse on campus by bringing interesting speakers from a range of backgrounds. And today we are particularly fortunate to have Professor Carlos Eire of Yale University. He is one of the world's most eminent scholars of late medieval and early modern Europe, with a specialty in Reformation history, both the Protestant and Catholic Reformations. You can see his full bio for a fulsome list of his many books. But on a personal note, I will say, in addition to having benefited from his Reformation histories, his memoir about growing up in Cuba, Waiting for Snow in Havana, won the National Book Award a number of years ago, and is really one of the most elegant, enchanting memoirs I've ever read. So highly recommend that as well. Professor Eire is also well known as a mentor to graduate students, including he has mentored many great medieval and Reformation historians teaching at a range of universities today. And he was an early mentor to our own university president, Ben Sass, who was here visiting with him a little bit earlier. So I also was fortunate to meet Carlos when I started my graduate studies at Yale about a quarter century ago. But to my everlasting regret, I didn't take a class from him. And I think I can point to any subsequent setbacks or disappointments in my academic career go to that omission. So anyway, but among other things, the Hamilton Center believes in the virtues of redemption, and so as my redemption, I'm hosting him here today. One other item I should add, getting to the Hamilton Center's commitments to the virtues of a free society, is as a refugee from Castro's Cuba, who found a new life and flourishing here in the United States, you'll see on Professor Eire's official bio that all of his books are banned in Cuba, where he has been proclaimed an enemy of the state. However, his bio also says that he regards that label as the highest of all honors. So he will be speaking to us today on his newest book, They Flew, A History of the Impossible. So we are in for a treat. Please join me in welcoming Professor Eire.
There, it's on. It's on. Well, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I want to thank everyone at the Hamilton Center who brought me here and has been treating me so well. This is wonderful. And it's also good to see a few old familiar faces. But talk about history of the impossible. I never dreamed I'd be here in mid-October and have fall weather. I was prepared for something a lot warmer, so I brought that with me. And also, the coincidences. I don't believe in coincidences. I walk into this library, and in the foyer over there, there's a poster for an exhibit featuring a portrait of Cuba's greatest national hero, Jose Marti. Coincidence? Nah. No, not at all. Okay. What is the history of the impossible? There are events, facts in history that, by our current scientific understanding of reality, are truly impossible. And that's what this talk is about, my foray into this topic. And what you have here before you is an image of St. Joseph of Cupertino, the greatest levitator in human history. And this is a 18th century painting of one of the events I will be describing later. But a little disclosure, how did I get into this topic? Exactly 40 years ago, summer of 1983, I went to visit Avila in Spain, and I went to visit the convent, the first convent at which Saint Teresa of Avila had entered as a nun. And I'm being taken around with a whole group of people. The tour guide was pointing out commonplace, everyday items in the convent. Oh, here's the kitchen. Here's the refectory where they ate. Here's the chapel. Here's the staircase where St. Teresa fell and broke her arm. And then we get to the locutorio, which is where the nuns who were cloistered would meet the outside world through a grill, pretty much like a prisoner, right? And then the tour guide says, and here's the spot where St. Teresa and St. John of the Cross levitated together for the first time. Not any different from the staircase or the kitchen or anything else, and my head exploded. I have got to work on this. Took me 40 years, but not continuously, but on and off, on and off, on and off. So this painting is from the 17th century. There are several depictions of this. The two of them were discussing the Holy Trinity through the girl, and whoop, as you can see in the painting, represents the oral report of this. John took up the chair with him. The heaviest, most intensely incandescent question: how can one write a history of the impossible? How do you write the history of something that can't happen? Or take it seriously? And I chose two impossible miracles that defy modern science and that are difficult to fake, one more difficult than the other. Levitation, and that's St. Ignatius Loyola, levitating and glowing. And bilocation. Being in two places at the same time. How can that happen? Well, historians deal with facts, right? Without facts, there is no history. Then it's pure myth or fiction. But there's a war between the facts, as I call it. Ernst Troeltsch came up with the concept of a social fact, right? So what's a social fact? A social fact is a belief that has such a grip on culture and society that it goes unquestioned. And we all live with these social facts that govern our behavior. They are facts, you know. For instance, there are many things that one is not supposed to say in public. Certain words that cannot be used in public. And that's a social fact. And you will get into a heap of trouble if you ignore that social fact. But social fact that we live with, prime example, is the belief that anomalous events, also called miracles, cannot ever be ascribed to supernatural causes. That's a social fact. Also, humans cannot defy gravity without technology. That's another social fact, undeniable. And also, humans cannot be present in two places simultaneously. That's a social fact. But there are other kinds of facts that we can study. And William James, I find comfort in these two 19th century figures, diametrically opposed in many respects. William James, author of Varieties of Religious Experience, brother of the novelist Henry James, spoke of wild facts. What are wild facts? Some anomalous events defy explanation. That's a wild fact. And we have thousands of reports of humans hovering or flying. That's a wild fact. And we also have thousands of reports of humans being in two places at the same time. That's a wild fact. That's the wild fact I work with. The evidence, the reports, the testimony is a wild fact. The event, levitation or bilocation, is a wild fact in and of itself. But the testimony is a wild fact of a different color, because the testimonies sometimes are just overwhelming. A little more on James and his wild fact, help us put this into context of how any historian dares to challenge what many are now calling dogmatic materialism. The belief that there is no reality or dimension beyond this. William James was very interested in this. He defined a wild fact as any occurrence that has no stall or pigeonhole into which the quote-unquote ordinary and critical mind can fit it. The alterity of these phenomena is so extreme, said James, that it becomes unclassifiable, as well as unimaginable, paradoxical absurdity that must be considered inherently untrue as well as impossible. And continuing with James, such wild facts puzzle scientists so much, he's observed, that they always prove more easy to ignore than to attend to, which is why they are ignored. Williams was very interested in psychic and mystical phenomena and very pained by the dismissive attitude displayed by his fellow scientists towards these phenomena. And most of them, he quipped, thought that passing, quote, from mystical to scientific speculations is like passing from lunacy to sanity. So, can also bring a few more voices in here. William Blake and his mind-forged manacles. Also, bring back Ernst Troeltsch and his social fact. And another grandfather of social science, Max Weber, who spoke of the iron cage, the shell that was as hard as steel of basically the social facts that cage us in, which is also what Blake referred to as the mind-forged manacles. Every age and culture has its own unquestionable beliefs, and our own culture tends to prize dogmatic materialism as a core belief. Simply put, rational thinking and empirical science have proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there is no such thing as a supernatural dimension. And such unquestionable pervasive beliefs, social facts, mind-forged manacles, steel-hard casing or iron cage, a century later are difficult to detect and acknowledge, for they frame our thinking. These mind-forged manacles frame our thinking and are very much like the air we breathe, which we take for granted as much as an octopus takes water for granted. That's why they're hard to spot. And even when they are perceived, these mind-forged manacles, for what they are, and that's very hard to do, these manacles and cages are still very hard to discard or displace. There are metaphysical and epistemological differences between the approaches of science and religion, and this is what is at bottom here. This is a rock solid foundation of our present situation of having two worldviews. How do we know what is really real and true, and how does one get to know what is really real and true? How does one do that? Science has the natural world, religion has the supernatural. Science focuses on matter, religion on spirit. Science on reason, religion on faith. Science on empiricism, religion on what? Experience. Always based on experience. Logic versus ecstasy, especially in the case of these two impossible miracles. And science, the temporal and spatial. Religion, the eternal and infinite. Two very different ways of looking at the world. And in fact, many of you are probably aware of the fact that there's a great deal of literature on the conflict between religion and science, or the warfare of science with theology, or as recently as 2015, title changed to Faith versus Fact. Why science and religion are incompatible. Yes, indeed. But here's, for me, a clue that led me in various directions. The fact that any time I would speak to my colleagues who deal with Asian religion about this project, their response was, yeah, so what? So what? This is what you expect of religion. This is what happens with religion. They were not the least bit surprised. Levitation and bilocation are normal in many world religions. And here I have images for only 3 of those. Tibetan Buddhism, Hinduism, and Islam. The image on the right-hand side is from 17th century Persia, and that's a Sufi mystic levitating. But of course, on the other side, magic can be a cheap trick. Levitation can be a cheap trick performed. How to levitate there, study that. Just Google how to levitate, and you'll get the instructions. You can even find a video. How to fool people into thinking you levitate, like David Blaine did in his, this show is 20-some years ago on CBS. And the camera always focused on the crowd that was watching David Blaine, quote unquote, levitate. And they all had the same body language, at least the ones they filmed and put on the documentary. They all backed away from him. The body language was one of, fear and terror. Oh my God. And one of his audience members says, oh, he must be such a holy man. It's a trick. Levitation is easy to fake under certain conditions, especially levitation that is only a few inches off the ground, and you are the member of a religious order that has habits that go all the way to the floor. Very easy. And I know I ran into hundreds of such fakers who got caught. In Christian history, however, levitation and bilocation are not something that any holy person can will to do. It's not an act of the will. It's not something learned. It is a byproduct, a side effect of mystical ecstasy. And here we have one of the earliest paintings of a Christian saint levitating. St. Francis of Assisi, painted by Giotto. And this is a passage from the Life of Francis by St. Bonaventure, who was himself a Franciscan and head of the Franciscan order. There he was beheld praying by night, his hands stretched out after the manner of a cross, his whole body uplifted from the earth and wrapped in a shining cloud, as though the wondrous illumination of the body were a witness unto the wondrous enlightenment of his mind. There's a mind aspect to this in the Bonaventure's account, because Bonaventure was a scholastic theologian, and mind was very, very, very important to him. But anyway, these phenomena that are linked here, rising and glowing, are paired throughout the Middle Ages and into the modern age. But what is a mystical ecstasy? What is mysticism? It's a dictionary various dictionary definitions. Union with or absorption into the deity or the absolute or the spiritual apprehension of knowledge inaccessible to the intellect, which may be attained through contemplation and self-surrender. Belief characterized by self-delusion or dreamy confusion of thought, especially when based on the assumption of occult qualities or mysterious agencies. The belief that direct knowledge of God, spiritual truth, or ultimate reality can be attained through subjective experience. Subjective, such as intuition or insight. And my favorite, vague speculation. A belief without a sound basis. Yes. As Dr. McCoy says to Spock in one of the Star Trek movies, I'm tired of your Vulcan mysticism. Yes, they should have put that in the dictionary. Ecstasy, mystical ecstasy in the Christian tradition is an encounter with the ultimate other. Ecstasy, here's the etymology for ecstasy, which means standing outside, from the Greek. A trance or trance-like state in which a person transcends normal consciousness is one of these dictionary definitions. State of consciousness, visions, or absolute euphoria. Already we're getting pathologized here. A term used to mean outside oneself or outside itself, and also a colloquial term for MDMA, a psychoactive drug that produces euphoria, especially when people go clubbing. Yeah, right? We all know that. And these are all images of St. Teresa of Avila in ecstasy. I could do a whole lecture just on representations of St. Teresa's ecstasies. But we can't do that today. Basically, mystical ecstasy is breaking through to the other side and not seeing Monty Python's God, but seeing God, which is where the Doors got the title for one of their best songs, Break On Through to the Other Side. From the Doors of Perception by Aldous Huxley. There's also mysticism for the mug and tote bag crowd. Yeah, the spiritual laws of success, sure. We'll give you some DVDs too, for DVD hoarders. Mysticism for the masses, yes. You can do this too, absolutely. And you can do it on public television, but God help you if you have a show on any other religion on PBS. Philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell. My favorite quote from Bertrand Russell. I see no difference between those men who eat too little and see heaven, those who drink too much and see snakes. My reply always, well, yeah, one sees snakes, the other one sees heaven. But it's true. I always tell my students in my mysticism course, go out in the woods by yourself, completely by yourself, as far in the woods as you can. Don't eat anything. Drink as little as possible water, drink, and deprive yourself of sleep. You'll be having visions by the end of the week. It's quite likely that you will. Lifestyle has everything to do with mysticism. But here's where we come to a fork in the road in history, in Christian history. The Protestant Reformation. All of medieval mysticism, much of it, not all of it, but much of it, and many of its chief assumptions are not just challenged, but rejected by Protestantism. And Max Weber, another social scientist, thought that the key turning point in the transition to modernity was the disenchantment of the world. In German, it's very different. Entzauberung doesn't mean disenchantment in German. It means taking the magic away. Ent is a prefix that means taking away, and Zauber is the German word for magic. So basically, what Weber was saying is medieval Catholicism was magical, and Protestants stripped the magic from religion, which he thought was a very good thing. That's what made us modern, the greatest step towards modernity. And by sheer coincidence, yeah, sure, coincidence, wink, wink. The only other time I visited the University of Florida, I gave a lecture here entitled Incombustible Weber, How Protestantism Really Disenchanted the World. So Weber and Gainesville are forever joined in my mind. So what happened? What happened is this. All the major Protestant reformers of the 16th century rejected the miracle claims of the medieval Catholic Church. And of course, as soon as Luther shows up, Catholic opponents of Luther are throwing miracles at him. Look what we have. Look at the miracles we have. Whatever you're saying, you can't really be anything but a heretic because you're condemning this church that's full of miracles. Early Protestant reformers do away with post-biblical miracles. And here are Luther's words: those visible works are simply signs for the ignorant, unbelieving crowd, and for their sakes that are yet to be attracted. But as for us who know already what we do know and believe in the gospel, what do we want them for? John Calvin, too, a second-generation reformer, even more so than Luther. We may also fitly remember that Satan has his miracles, which, though they are deceitful tricks, rather than true powers, are such a sort as to mislead the simple-minded and untutored. Comment on 2 Thessalonians. And idolatry has been nourished by wonderful miracles, yet these are not sufficient to sanction the superstition. That's another loaded term, superstition. Right? Either of magicians or idolaters. There's a lot of terms thrown in there that talk about subjective. They are subjective terms. Because one society's religion can be viewed as idolatry or superstition by another society. And this principle of the rejection of post-biblical miracles has a name, especially in the Reformed Protestant tradition, known as the cessation of miracles. Cessationism is a doctrine that affirms that miracles described in the Bible ceased at the end of the apostolic age with the death of the last apostle, John, so around the year 100. No more miracles. Why? Because the church was already established, and the only need for miracles was to establish the church. And the greatest miracle of all, unmatched by any healing, was the fact that the church was established and grew without healing miracles, or mystical ecstasies, or levitations, or bilocations. And this book by B.B. Warfield, this is 1917 edition. Notice, facts versus fake, counterfeit miracles. More Calvin. That the gift of healing was temporary, all are constrained to affirm, and events clearly prove. Then, the sign of it ought not to be deemed perpetual. It hence follows that they who at this day set anointing among the sacraments, this was a dispute whether the Reformed Church should use sacred oil to anoint the sick and dying, are not true followers, but apes of the apostles, except they seek to restore the effect produced by it, which God has taken away from the world for more than 1,400 years. But just think of it from a purely dogmatic materialist perspective. Why would Calvin say this? Because they're still throwing miracles at him, the Catholics are. Prove your church is the true church. We have miracles, you don't. So, of course, what has happened since 1519 or so is that all Catholic miracles are ascribed to the devil by Protestants. But then comes the age of reason and the Enlightenment. Baruch Spinoza. He argued that nature cannot be contravened, but that she preserves a fixed and immutable course. Thus, a miracle is a sheer absurdity. And by the way, if you Google age of reason, sunglasses, or the specific names of philosophers from the age of reason and sunglasses, you will get lots of images. And I don't know what caused this, but it's a fact. Not just a social fact, it's a fact. You know, the Enlightenment is so bright, I guess they have to wear sunglasses. His argument, the will of God is identical with the laws of nature. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. Necessarily, God's will is inviolable. Therefore, miracles cannot happen. Voltaire. It is impossible a being infinitely wise can have made laws to violate them. How unreasonable. He could not derange the machine, but with a view of making it work better. But it is evident that God, all wise and omnipotent, originally made this immense machine, the universe, as good and perfect as he was able. If he saw that some imperfections would arise from the nature of matter, he provided for that in the beginning. And accordingly, he will never change anything in it. And this is from his philosophical dictionary. David Hume. And I know he has several fans in the room. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature. And as a firm and unalterable experience as has established these laws, the proof against a miracle from the very nature of the fact is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. The plain consequence is, and it is a general maxim worthy of our attention, that no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact which it endeavors to establish. A little bit of Humean logic here. A miracle supported by any human testimony is more properly a subject of derision than of argument. So therefore, all these testimonies that I'm basing my history of the impossible on, right? They're worthy of ridicule. And I'll pause for a second. I've been giving talks on this for quite some time since I was working on this project over so many years. One time, a member of the audience, can't remember if it was male or female. Excuse me, Professor Eire, what you're doing is not the history of the impossible, it's the history of the ridiculous. So, there you have it. It's the same thing when I talk about Cuba to public audiences. The first question I always get, how much property did your family own? That settles it. My testimony is invalid. On the Catholic side, something very interesting happens. 17th century is the peak period for flying in Western Europe. And I'll get back to this in a few minutes. Why is that the peak period for flying? In the Catholic Church, the age of reason creeps in, and in the canonization process, this man in particular, Prospero Lambertini, who then would become Pope Benedict XIV, rewrites the rules for canonizing saints and for proving miracles. And he makes the participation of scientists and physicians essential, absolutely necessary for the canonization process to vet the narratives and the miracles, as well as creating the office of the devil's advocate, the person who opposes all the testimony and hurls every possible objection at the evidence. And he himself, before he became Pope, was a devil's advocate. See, there are no coincidences. He wants to stress heroic virtue over miracles as a proof of holiness. Because you cannot absolutely deny heroic virtue, anyone's heroic virtue. But he still has to deal with miracles, because for heaven's sakes, he's Pope now. He's the one who canonizes Joseph of Cupertino, the flying friar. And there's a timeline of his holding of different offices and his multi-volume rewriting of the laws for canonization, which when I first saw the title, I said, oh, I got to read this. And then I saw how large it was. And I said, no, thank you. I just want the Cliff Notes version. I get the gist of it. And on the Catholic side, of course, there's a long tradition of miracles and intellectuals trying to deal with the miraculous. And as early as the 4th and 5th century, St. Augustine took up the issue because a Manichaean, Augustine had been a Manichaean previously, had argued that Christian miracles are contrary to nature and therefore false. But I'll give you the short version of what is there in print. He replied by distinguishing two ways in which contrary to nature may be taken. If it's understood to mean contrary to the divinely established and universal order of things, then clearly, as Voltaire said, God can no more act in this way than he can act against himself. That's Voltaire's argument. But he adds, there's nothing wrong in saying that God does something against nature when it is contrary to what we know of nature. It seems contrary to nature, but what is really going on is that our minds have not been able to perceive the real working of nature and how the supernatural works in it. So, did Protestants really disenchant the world? Remember that quote from Calvin, Satan has his miracles. And this image, 19th century image, is a classic story of Luther's meeting with the devil while he was translating the Bible into German at the Wartburg Castle. Devil showed up and Luther supposedly threw an inkwell at the devil. A made-up story. A fact? We don't know for sure. We do know this for sure, though. Followers of Luther visiting the Wartburg Castle for centuries started to scratch at the ink spot on the wall. And so much so that the spot on the wall had to be recreated over and over and over and over again. And Luther saw the devil, heard the devil, not feared, battled with the devil numerous times. So, Protestants did not deny that levitations and bilocations took place. They surely did happen. But whenever they occurred, they were the work of the devil. All miracles claimed by the Catholic Church were either faked or produced by the devil. Now, here's a quote from Martin Luther's Table Talk. Luther had dinner with his students every night, and as the beer flowed, there were always students taking notes. But as the beer flowed, his tongue got looser and looser, and the students scribbling notes ever more rapidly. It's known as Luther's Table Talk. This is just one of many quotes of this nature. The devil seeks me out when I am at home in bed, and I always have one or two devils waiting to pounce on me. They are smart devils. If they can't overwhelm my heart, they grab my head and plague me there. And when that proves useless, I show them my ass, for that's where they belong. And this is one of the milder statements from the Tischreden. I didn't dare quote some of the others. One of Luther's most frequently used words in regards to the devil, Scheiß, S-H-I-T, because that's where the devil belongs. So, while Protestants rejected much of Catholic theology, and this has remained a puzzle for me, they accepted most of Catholic demonology, full-blown. Shape-shifting, flying and demonic animal companions were, in fact, in league with the devil and their minions, the witches. And shape-shifting, in the table talk, Luther speaks of one time he came back up to his room at the Wartburg where he was translating the Bible, and he saw a black dog in his bed that he had never seen at the castle before. So he did what any reasonable person would do, or any reasonable Christian. He threw it out the window. And then he ran all the way down to the bottom of the cliff on which the castle sat to find the dog and couldn't find it, which proved to him that was the devil. And he did the right thing. And these images are from a late medieval treatise on witchcraft that Protestants would use without changing a word. Ulrich Molitor's of Witches and Women Diviners. And there you see what's going on. See the shape-shifting witches flying on a pitchfork? A witch on a pitchfork being carried up, levitating? How do you explain levitation? The devil takes the witches up. And that's a demonic animal companion, the male witch. And these are two images of witches' flight on the eve of the Protestant Reformation. Hans Baldung Green, 1510, and Albrecht Dürer, same year, 1510. And notice all the accoutrements of Halloween witches, especially the flying aspect. And notice that in these representations, the witches are all female. So, witch persecutions begin. And let me put it this way. Catholics and Protestants hunted witches with equal ferocity. Equal ferocity. There's nothing nice about this. Nothing. No side comes out cleaner than the other when it comes to this, in terms of the numbers of people killed. The numbers have been downsized since the 1970s. We're now, I can't remember what the latest figure is, but it's not as high as it was when I was in high school, which was a long time ago. And by the way, this is a Lutheran witch burning in Derneburg. And the image accompanies this Flugblätter, or flyleaf, which tells you the whole story, the horrible story of these witches who end up being burned. And there's the devil, right? Coming to where the witches are burning. Protestant witch burning in Switzerland, 1585. And Swedish witch burning, 1669. But that's not just the witch burning, but it's the whole devil's Sabbath, the witch's Sabbath. I don't have time to go into this, but it's a counter ritual. The witches have a counter demonic ritual that they practice, and a key element of this ritual is, bringing Luther back into the picture. You see it there above the witch who is being burned. A witch is getting ready to perform a key element of the ritual, which is to kiss the devil's behind. And here's some more Protestant belief in demonic levitation from an English book, Joseph Glanville, Sadducismus Triumphatus, 1681. Notice how late that is, 1681. Showing manifestations of the devil. And this is the frontispiece to the book. And here are two levitation narratives from this book. Notice the young person floating to the ceiling and the men trying to grab him and pull him down. We have exactly same descriptions of the nuns in Teresa of Avila's convent trying to pull her down and being unable to do so, right? And where do we get our images for Halloween? This is Wonders of the, on the right-hand side, Wonders of the Invisible World, written by Cotton Mather, Puritan divine, Boston area. who had taken part in the Salem witch trials. And this book is written just after the witch trials. And notice the title is cramped up at the top. The title by which this treatise is known is The Wonders of the Invisible World, in which he sought to prove that the devil existed and did terrible things through witches. And one of my happiest moments while working on this book, I had been looking for a narrative description of a demonic levitation in the Protestant culture. I found one. 1693 Boston. Cotton Mather was involved. A teenage girl possessed by the devil who levitated. And not only levitated, but levitated just like the character played by Linda Blair in the first movie, The Exorcist. She was on her bed and she kept going up. So Cotton Mather brought some burly men into the room to pray for her and also to pile themselves on top of her to prevent her from rising. And they couldn't. She went up anyway. And then they tried to pull her down and couldn't do that either. And then Cotton Mather had these men write and sign affidavits that they had, in fact, witnessed such a thing. Of course it could all be faked. Of course. But this doesn't belong in the late 17th century. But it does. Now, winding down. Early modern Catholic levitation. There are more recorded levitations in the 15th and 16th century than in any other century. Among Catholics, it is saints, witches, and demoniacs who levitate. Among Protestants, it's only demonic, but they're everywhere. Those witches are everywhere, and thousands of them get executed. This is St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And notice how similar this is to that painting by Giotto of Francis of Assisi. He is not only levitating, but also glowing. And this is from an illustrated life of St. Ignatius, 1609. And this is St. Teresa of Avila levitating right in front of the Bishop of Avila. This, like the other illustration, comes from a graphic hagiography. In case any of you in art history or literature are interested in a good topic, like we have graphic novels. Well, in the 17th century, very popular genre of hagiography was basically very little text, lots of images. And this is where we find these. The force of this rapture was so tremendous that without being able to resist it, Teresa rose up higher than the window through which the bishop was about to give her communion. And there's another rendition of that levitation, dual levitation that set me on my quest. And again, there are no coincidences. The Carmelites, the Carmelite nuns who own this image would not give me permission to use it in my book. They didn't like what I had to say. There you go. And here's my favorite levitation story. I'll paraphrase. One time the nuns walk into the kitchen and Teresa has a frying pan in her hand and whoop, up she goes. Frying pan happens to contain the last little bit of olive oil left in the convent, so they don't want to spill it, but they're trying to pull her down and they're worried they're going to spill it. Holy Mother was so very humble. She dearly wished not to be considered a saint, so she constantly begged me and her other daughters to pull down hard on her vestments whenever we saw her rising into the air. And whenever she'd begin to feel that the Lord wanted to elevate her, she'd grab onto the floor mats and the grills in the choir. That's testimony from her canonization inquest. And this is first person. Teresa of Avila is the only mystic I have been able to find who gives you a first person description of what it is like to levitate. And this is one of her descriptions. It can't be resisted. And at other times, resisting has been impossible. My soul has been carried away instead, and quite often my head too, along with it, without being able to stop it. And sometimes my whole body, which has been lifted off the ground. I must confess, levitation produced an exceedingly great fear in me at first, terrible fear, because one sees one's body being lifted up from the ground, and although the spirit draws it up after itself, does so very gently if no resistance is offered. One does not lose consciousness. One is able to realize one is being lifted up. At least this is what happened to me. Her pseudoscientific explanation of levitation is that the soul gets pulled up towards heaven very fast, and the body has to follow after it. Now, drawing to a close, Joseph of Cupertino, constant levitations. I'm going to show you some images. The text is there for my own, recalling my own memory, the details. I'm not going to read that to you. Levitated constantly. Always some mystical ecstasy. Usually a religious icon would make him, things in nature would make him go up. Words would make him go up. Sounds, even animals. He was very prone to going up, levitating anytime he saw a lamb, because of Christ being the Lamb of God. And when he went up, he always made a noise. And 3 Italian words, 3 different kinds of noise. Grido, shout. Strillo, a little higher. And then urlo. One time, the description is that an urlo made the whole monastery shake so much that all the Franciscan friars ran out of their cells yelling, "Earthquake, earthquake." But he flew high, he flew often. Here we see him taking a cross that was being erected outdoors. The workman had a hard time doing it, and like Superman, he flies up to the cross, grabs it, and sinks it into the hole. When he sees the shrine of Loreto in northern Italy, where the house that Jesus was raised in Nazareth, supposedly brought by angels, to talk about impossible miracles, he went into an ecstasy and flew. And this is the most often depicted levitation scene in Joseph's life, which we saw at the very beginning. He converted a Lutheran prince by levitating. My question still is, what was this Lutheran prince doing in Italy, attending a Catholic Mass? Well, he's probably already on his way to conversion, but Joseph gets a lot of credit for this. He could cure people and also take people up with him. Here he's grabbing a young man who was insane by the hair and curing him and levitating him simultaneously. He shocks the Admiral of Castile, that is, the Spanish viceroy to southern Italy and Naples and Sicily, went to visit him in Assisi. And he flew over their heads and made the wife of the viceroy faint. She had to be revived with holy water. And he levitated right over the Pope's head, Urban VIII. And Urban supposedly said, "Oh, if he dies before I do, I will testify at his canonization inquest that he flew over my head." But Urban VIII died first, So, another phenomenon in Baroque art, Catholic Baroque art, we begin to see many depictions of medieval levitating saints who had not been represented all too often levitating. And here we have two from a Spanish-Italian artist, Vicente Carduccio. That's St. Francis on the left and St. Anthony of Padua on the right. Both of them 13th century. And here's, this painting hangs in the Louvre. It's enormous. Stolen by Napoleon's soldiers and never returned. A Franciscan who was on kitchen duty and went into ecstasy, levitating and glowing, and angels came to finish his kitchen work, which he was obligated to do under his vow of obedience. It's a huge painting. One more thing, bilocation. No one has bilocated more extremely than this woman, Sor Maria de Agreda, an exact contemporary of Joseph of Cupertino. She served as a missionary, even though she never physically left her convent in northeastern Spain, in Agreda. Evangelized the natives in present-day Texas and New Mexico, where in local lore, to this day, she is known as the Lady in Blue. And here's a brand new monument to the Lady in Blue from San Angelo, Texas, 2021. Lady in Blue because her habit had a component that was bluish. "500 bilocations, that many miles." These are her bilocations. It's not flying, so it's not frequent flyer miles. You're simultaneously. How to explain that? There are various explanations, and I can't go into it, but her case is unique because of the number of levitations. There were other nuns, too, in Spain doing the same thing. And also, I discovered towards the end of my project in Mexico, and the Mexican nuns who went to other places as missionaries, even more incredible feats. They didn't just act as missionaries. One of them claimed to have fought English pirates in the Caribbean. Another one claimed to have taken part in a battle in the 30 Years' War. So what's going on here? Yes, of course there's faking and exaggeration going on. But Maria de Agreda's levitations are hard to explain away for reasons of testimony, including the fact that she became an intimate confidant of King Philip IV, who believed her. Has it stopped? No. Here are two major 20th century bilocators and stigmatists. Padre Pio is well known among Catholics, but Sister Yvonne Aimée de Malestroit, French nun, is not so well known. Numerous testimonies of people who have saw both of these individuals in two spots at once. And Sister Yvonne Marie was not just a bilocator. She was a warrior. She helped the French underground, and she helped downed Allied pilots escape by dressing them as nuns and finding them ways out of France. And she also supposedly visited people in prison and concentration camps through bilocation. French President Charles de Gaulle pinned on her the Légion d'honneur. She won 5 other medals for her participation in the war effort. And I usually, if I started to pitch this as a book, I start with the warrior part. And the reaction always is, oh, that would make such a great book. That would make such a great movie. Then I hit them with the second part. Oh, not greeted so enthusiastically. Who is the first levitator on earth that we can document? This man, Jean-François Pilat de Rosier, the first human being ever to go up in a hot air balloon, who would later die trying to cross the English Channel on a hot air balloon because he mixed two elements that shouldn't be mixed in the gas. But we know he did it for sure. And then it returns in the 19th and 20th century with spiritualism. Levitation was one of the great parlor tricks. That's where we get the term parlor trick, is from 19th century spiritualism, where not only individuals like David Douglas Home, pictured on the right-hand side, but they also levitated tables, or this Welsh, I forget his name, this Welsh spiritualist. There's an infrared photo of him levitating. To me, it looks like he's being lifted up by cables. Which, by the way, is one of the reasons I think Joseph Cupertino is very important, because he levitated outdoors to great heights, supposedly, which is very hard to fake. So, yes, levitation is possible. My son spent 2 years in Japan and rode a levitating train many times. So I have an eyewitness testimony at home. And you can buy gadgets that float to put on your desk and impress or scare people away. I don't know about you, but I bilocated a lot in 2020, 2021. Still bilocating. Yeah. So, and I could have bilocated for this lecture, but of course not as many of you would have shown up. But who knows what else one might say. I'll end with this long quote from another scholar at Rice University who has written a book titled Authors of the Impossible, which I didn't discover till I was nearly done with my own work. Oh, somebody took the title. Oh, wow. Jeffrey Kripal is very impatient with dogmatic materialism. And here's a quote from one of his many books, and I'll end with this. I can't tell you how many times I've heard an otherwise admired colleague say something like, well, it doesn't really matter if Joseph of Cupertino flew up to the tree after a scream, or if Teresa of Avila floated off the floor as her sisters piled on top of her to avoid a social embarrassment. What matters is how the popular belief in such presumed levitations was disciplined, controlled, and maintained by the church, and later constructed as sanctity and as a saint. Really? I want to pull out my hair in such moments. A super pious Italian man ecstatically flies into a tree and has to be retrieved with a ladder, or a raptured Spanish nun cannot keep herself on the floor in front of some visiting noblewomen, and these physical events do not matter to you? Excuse me. If either of those things actually happened, and our historical records suggest strongly that they did, such anomalous events change pretty much everything we thought we knew about human consciousness and its relationship to physics, gravity, and material reality. Either single event would fundamentally change our entire order of knowledge. And you don't care? Don't you find that disinterest just a little bit perverse? I do. So I'll end it there. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Love questions. Is there a microphone here? There we go.
Yes. Thank you very much for an interesting lecture. I'm wondering if in the Catholic sources, before the Protestant Reformation, there was ever an association of these kind of miracles, especially of levitation, with superbia, with spiritual pride, that was manifested in this way. Was this critiqued within the monastery? Because, I mean, there's a lot of...
I have not run into that. As a matter of fact, a lot of the fakers who get discovered because they are, in fact, growing a little bit too proud, and they fall under investigation. So I think there's an interesting connection there just in terms of the fakery. But no, superbia never makes you levitate. And as Teresa described it, it's very common. It's kind of an irresistible gift that comes at unexpected moments. Yeah, there's the microphone.
Thank you very much for that really fascinating talk. So I was struck by the Protestants sort of being more inclined to the demonology, and I was thinking today about sort of the popularity of horror movies and sort of this interest in the paranormal. So there seems to be something about sort of the evil side of things that people find almost easier to believe than sort of like the powers of goodness, or and maybe that's wrapped in. I mean, my kind of sense of it has to do with the way that fear can grip us, and like. But you have a sense of that psychologically, sort of explanations why people incline this sort of whole, witch trials and so forth, like how that, in the modern period was, much more prominent than some of the, you might say saintly miracles.
I think there's definitely a psychological and emotional dimension, but there's also still kind of the theological dimension at least for the leaders of the Protestant Reformation. I'm not talking about common people. The thing is, you've got this substratum that doesn't go away, right, of belief in the devil and evil spirits and all this. And the Protestant Reformation has much harder time sweeping that away than sweeping what's on the surface, which is like the images on the churches and change things. So the substratum is there. And it bubbles up especially intensely in the 17th century, but why? I've read some social scientific studies that show through statistics that the worst witch hunts took place in locations where there were people of the other faith in close proximity, right? Where there was tension about what was the true religion, what was not the true religion. But technically speaking, as far as theology is concerned, it was easier to believe as a theologian that the devil could do these things because of the medieval demonology. The devil had no supernatural agency, technically. Supernatural belongs only to God, above and what the devil had was several things working in his favor. His age, he was incredibly ancient, so he had a lot of experience. His angelic nature, higher than humans, he was smarter, much smarter than any human. So he had preternatural powers. What's preternatural? Comic book superheroes have preternatural powers. They're not supernatural. He knew how to manipulate nature. In other words, this begins in the 14th century. The devil is like a modern day scientist. He knows how nature works and knows how to manipulate it. So the Protestant theologians borrow this completely without changing it until later. There are differences of opinion. But as far as common people are concerned, there's this substratum of belief in evil spirits, demonic spirits, and witches.
What about today with horror movies?
I'm sorry?
Horror movies.
The horror movies. There's a human fascination with the horrible and with monsters. For instance, this also, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a whole genre of, especially Lutheran popular literature. These the fly leaves that I showed, many of them show monstrous births, both animals and humans, monstrous births. And then they're interpreted as signs from God. Oh, if this happened, it's because we're doing something wrong and God wants us to correct it. So the monstrous always raises them. I often wonder what will happen if there are still humans on Earth 300 years from now, and science has advanced, how early 21st century American culture will be explained. All the most popular movies are horror films or superhero films. What are they going to think? Did people really believe in this? I don't know. But it's a great question. Yeah.
I find myself thinking about all of the testimony of UFOs, which is such a prevalent thing today.
Yes, UFOs, or what's the new term? APUs? ADUs? There's a new technical term.
Unidentified aerial phenomenon.
Yeah, UAP. Jeffrey Kripal links all these things together. And as a matter of fact, he co-wrote a book with Whitley Strieber, who wrote a book about his own abduction experience. I can't go there.
Aliens have taken the place of something supernatural.
Right. I can't go there because I don't know enough about this subject. But the latest thinking, higher level thinking about aliens is linked to cutting edge astrophysics and nuclear physics about the convergence of different dimensions, the multiverse and the different dimensions and the way in which, I got a very interesting email from a scientist in Wales, UK, who got a preview of my book. He was all excited about levitation, because even before my book got to his hands, he was researching this as a physicist. And he had already been convinced that levitation is a suspension of time-space continuum. And actually, he was very, very happy to see my description of some of the phenomena that accompany levitation. One, the fact, especially in Joseph of Cupertino, we have so many accounts of this. When he goes up, the clothing he's wearing doesn't move. It's like a statue, as if he were sculpted from marble. Even when he's going through the air, his habit does not float. Two, it's a cataleptic seizure, actually. I didn't mention this, but these ecstasies have a medical term, cataleptic seizure. You freeze up and you lose sensation. All of these levitators, the 17th century ones, at one point, if they're levitating, they get pricked with needles. They have lit candles way before their eyes to see if they would blink. Nothing. And then the third thing that this Welsh scientist was so thrilled about, suspension of time and space. Many of these levitators, when they return to the ground, pick up doing exactly what they were doing when they went up. And in the case of many of them, since they're priests, they go up saying Mass, and some of them, after floating in the air for 2 or 3 hours, come back down and pick up the Mass exactly at the point where they left off, as if no time had elapsed. Oh, he was so thrilled by that. But UAPs, UFOs, I don't know. Yeah. Clay, I'll get to you next.
Thank you, Dr. Eire. I'm reminded that in the early 19th century, we might have gone to one of the best universities in Europe and learned that we would never find Troy, for example, or Mycenae, right? Those are inventions of poets, and poets are liars, and
Yes.
Homer's the biggest liar of all. And Schliemann, who unfortunately didn't have a good college education, he was so gullible that he went out and he found both of them. He looked where Homer said, and he found them. It reminds me of something Donald Kagan, whom I know you know, called the higher naivete, that in the beginning, you're gullible, you believe anything, you go off to college, you learn something, suddenly you don't believe anything at all. And then you reach the point of wisdom, which he called the higher naivete, where you know what you should believe, even though you can't quite say why. So I'm just curious if you have for yourself a set of rules or just an instinct about how you decide what you can believe and what you can't believe.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. That's a wonderful question. And of course, you know, as I showed, science proceeds on experiment and religion on experience. Experience. Have I seen anybody levitate? No. Have I seen anybody bilocate? No. Have I ever seen a ghost? No. A UFO? No. So I can't go on experience of that sort. But I can go on experience of testimonies. To me, that's the bottom line, for me anyway. Testimonies. What's in it for all these people to lie? And to lie so outrageously? Because it's one thing to lie, but it's another thing to lie outrageously. And to have testimonies that match. It's just the mathematical probability of collusion on the part of all these different people. To me, it keeps going down, the probability, the higher the number of testimonies. So actually, that's why I like Joseph of Cupertino. That's why I like Maria de Agreda, because there's that mathematical probability thing. But I should tell you all, I failed at trigonometry in high school. So maybe I should not be trusted when it comes to mathematical things. But as I always tell my students, see, it's possible to fail and do something else with your life. But there's something, I don't know how to word it. It's not just the mathematical dimension of this, but the very simple fact that it's not just, we're not talking just about Christian levitators. This is found throughout the world. And the bilocation is the same thing that's found throughout the world. And these things persist. Healing miracles, see, I don't consider healing miracles impossible, because one of the procedures instituted by Prospero Lambertini, this insertion of medical personnel and scientific personnel in the canonization process, was to get real scientific experts to say, this does not happen. Parentheses, according to our present medical knowledge. And I've always envied that job. There's one man in Rome, Vatican, who heads the investigation on whether miracles happen or not. And the closest I have come is we had a student once who was a real schmoozer. He could work his way into places other people couldn't go. He was just a charmer. And he spent a summer in Rome and managed to charm this man at the Vatican who runs the miracle proving thing. He came back to Yale with the dossier in English for Mary Elizabeth Seton, one of the first Americans to be canonized. And it was a medical case. I read through it, doctor after doctor after doctor saying, this cannot happen, this cannot happen, this, what was it? A girl had been born without any nerves in her ears. She had no hearing nerves. So she was born deaf. And the nerves suddenly appeared, regenerated. So there was all this testimony, not just from doctors, but also biologists and neurologists and everybody else. We don't know. We can't explain this. That's as far as they'll go, right? We have never seen nerves regenerate in a, I think she was like 5 years old when we have never seen this. And I read somewhere an article written about this man who, of course, the man keeps changing. Quoted as saying, what I do is I look for atheists. That's the kind of expert I look for. I prefer atheists who can say, we can't explain this. So that's the other side of that.
Can I selfishly ask a question here?
Sure.
So I was quite interested in your talk and the place of the Protestant Reformation in it. I'm wondering how teleological this is for you, looking at Weber, and obviously there's like more modern secularization theories, Charles Taylor, for example, is famous one. But there's been some really interesting work done. Philip Sorgel came up with a book called Miracles and the Protestant Imagination, as you might know, and the Evangelical Wonder Book in Germany. And even that quote from Calvin at the very end, there's this very ambiguous claim where he says, we also have our abundance of miracles, but we don't talk about, like, they're not that important, and he downplays them, right? So in terms of like maybe social history, is this still there, do you think, in the Reformation, or is it just being downplayed? And also, did it have to continue the trajectory, do you think, towards like the Spinoza era that you mentioned later, or is there some contingency there?
Well,
I'm just curious your thoughts.
Well, I oversimplified for my lecture, that there are various streams all flowing at the same time and flowing from different directions, going in different directions. And there's also a spectrum, whereas Lutherans were more accepting of natural signs and wonders than Calvinists, right? And so on. The skeptics, the pure skeptics. That's going on. And nothing necessarily leads to Spinoza and Voltaire. But the fact remains, and this is my take on the Entzauberung, or disenchantment. Yes, the world is desacralized to a considerable extent by the Protestant Reformation, any way you look at it. Because there's this new conception, very modern, that matter and spirit are two very separate categories, and they don't often coalesce. And you find that to some extent in Luther, to a greater extent in Calvin, and then later Calvinists, I can't remember the book, but I remember reading that by the 18th century in Geneva, all of the Genevan clergy were closet deists who kept performing the same rituals and so on, but deep down inside they were Voltaireans. So all these things are, I think, well, let me bring this up. There's a historian, Robert Scribner, who wrote a very influential article taking on Weber and saying, no, Protestants did not desacralize the world because they continued having rituals. And that was my initial response. Like, my head moved when I read it. Wait a minute, rituals are not magic. That's so. Just the fact that you keep having rituals and saying prayers is not the same thing as expecting someone to go into mystical ecstasy and rise up in the air. There was someone who had a question here. Well, yeah, right here. I promised her she would be next. So
Thank you. By chance, have you read The Water Dancer? It's by an African American, and I can't pronounce nor remember his name, but you're right, there is no such thing as coincidence, because I just finished that book 10 days ago.
title of the book?
The Water Dancer.
The Water Dancer. No, I've never heard
I
of it.
highly recommend it. It stunned a group of us that like to read, and it has both levitation and bilocation in it. So it has, it has evoked a lot of questions in my mind that at least I've entertained differently through your talk. So thank you. But it is a wonderful book about slavery and how they were able to relocate themselves from Virginia Plantation, for example, to New York through the channel of water, sometimes walking right over water, and how they would have people, freed slaves, come and assist them across the river. It's just a fascinating, wonderful novel, just like yours, which I want you to please dedicate later.
Making a reference to my first memoir, which one Canadian reviewer said, I got carried away with my magical realism. When in fact, everything he was labeling magical realism actually happened. But I never saw anybody levitate.
So we have time for one more question there.
Thank you. So at a confessional level, let's say Catholics allow levitation. They don't allow incombustible portraits of Luther.
Right.
For Lutherans, it's the opposite.
Right.
Right. So my question is, how often does the allegedly impossible actually redefine the received range of the possible? How often does it simply vindicate it? Portraying Ignatius of Loyola like St. Francis vindicates the Catholic range.
Of course, yeah.
Portraying Luther that way would obviously completely upend the entire thing.
Yeah, no, there is this confirmation. The whole story about the Lutheran prince who converts, for instance, is another instance of this. He goes in there full Lutheran, and actually one of his companions is quoted as saying, oh, he stamps his foot and he says, oh, I wish I'd never come to this place because I was so secure in my beliefs, but now everything has changed. Oh, how convenient, right? So there is some of this, the polemical dimension of this can never be removed. Can never be, and actually, mystical ecstasy itself plays a very considerable polemical role. Ecstasy as polemic. Yes, ecstasy is polemical. Look what happens to our people. Yeah, it doesn't happen to you. But of course, if it happens among Protestants, there's always a question mark. Why this person has got to have some kind of demonic. So you do have back to the social fact, right? In a community, you have the social fact that if somebody starts floating off the floor, it's demonic, and it kind of proves itself within the community. It didn't occur to Cotton Mather and these men that this young teenager could have been a wayward, bilocating Catholic from somewhere in Europe. No. She's a local, everybody knows her, and it can only be the devil. So yeah, but we don't have any statistics on how many people are convinced one way or another. What still intrigues me is the social construction of the interpretation of an impossible event when it's viewed. Some of these testimonies for the 20th century nun I brought up at the end, they're just into the testimonies are incredible. And I find this odd. Talk about, culture. 95% of what has been written about this nun is in French and has never been translated into English. There are plenty of English-speaking Catholics. What's going on here? Why not? There's a 5-volume biography of this nun in French. Nobody has ever translated it. Why? You would think there's a polemical edge to this story, right? But I don't know. And those of you that didn't get to ask questions, I'll be hanging around a little bit afterwards. So.
Please join me in giving Dr. Eire a warm round of applause. Thank you very much. That was wonderful, Carlos. Thank you so much. So, all right. It is a full week at the Hamilton Center. I hope you've enjoyed this one. And in 24 hours, we are going to be traversing from 15th century levitation to 21st century family formation. Where am I going with this? Well, tomorrow, same time, 4 o'clock, in the Florida Gymnasium, and you can get the info on our website, Florida Gymnasium, room 280. We are hosting Professor Melissa Carney, an economist from the University of Maryland, who has published easily the most controversial and talked about economics book this year. It's been causing a lot of national discussion all over the national media. The title of the book is The Two-Parent Privilege: How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. So it talks about the empirical data on the importance of two parents for child welfare. But with a title like that, and you'll see she's a very engaging person, I'm told that any of you here who are suffering romantic angst, she's also giving out relational advice tomorrow. So anyway, all sorts of reasons to be there. So please join us for that. Thank you again for coming out today. And Dr. Eire is happy to take a few more questions up here informally, he said. So, but appreciate seeing all of you. Thank you.